Hi, in this video I will be explaining some music theory things using the Deluge instead of a piano. This one will be all about seventh chords. Now before I begin, this is kind of a sequel to a video I did a while back where I explained what triads are and intervals and some other basic things. So if you're not familiar at all with that, maybe that's the better place to start. But if you've heard of those things before, the quick recap I'm about to give you might do as well. So before we get to those seventh chords, let's refresh the memory on what triads are real quick. A triad is a 3-note chord which can be stacked vertically in thirds. There are 4 different types of triads: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. And there are 3 different inversions possible for every triad. The root position, which means the root is at the bottom. First inversion means the third is at the bottom. And the second inversion is the 5th at the bottom. So yeah, that's basically it. Let's move on to the 7th chords. Now, a 7th chord can be looked at as a triad with yet another third stacked on top of it.
So I'm entering one more time our 4 bass triads into the Deluge, turning off scale mode here so we can actually see the interval structure. And the first one will be a major third at the bottom and a minor third on top for a major triad. And then the second one will be a minor third at the bottom and a major third on top for a minor triad. Then next there will be 2 minor thirds for a diminished triad. And then lastly there's 2 major thirds, which unfortunately don't fit onto the grid, so I have to scroll up a little bit here. This gives us an augmented triad. Like I said, we get to the 7th chord by just adding either a minor or a major third on top of the bass triad.
Because there's 2 different types of thirds and 4 different types of triads. If we combine those, we get a total of 8 different possible 7th chords. So let's go over those real quick.
Let's start with the 2 major chords, and we can either add a major third or a minor third on top. And what this leads to is a major 7th chord and a dominant 7th chord.
The first one would be a major chord with a major third on top. This would lead to a major 7th in relation to the root note, which is called a major 7th chord. We call this a major 7th chord because both the 3rd and the 7th are major, so it'd be kind of pointless to call it a major 7th chord. If we look at the second option, stacking a minor third on top of a major chord, what we get is a minor 7th, and the underlying triad has a major third. So this one we could call a major minor 7th chord, or more frequently it's also just called a dominant 7th chord. This has to do with the function it has in functional harmony.
Then we have the same 2 options for the minor chord. So we've got here a minor triad, and on top either a major or a minor third. Let's have a listen to those 2 as well. The first one is going to be a minor triad with a major third on top. This will lead to a major 7th between the root and the top note, and we call this chord a minor major 7th chord. And in the second chord, what we get is a minor 7th when we add this minor third on top of the minor triad. This chord is called a minor 7th chord. Then next we've got 2 diminished triads here, and here we can also add a major and a minor third on top of those. Let's have a closer look at those 2 chords as well. For the first one we added a major third on top of a diminished triad, and what this leads to is a minor 7th between the root and the top note. We usually call this chord a half diminished chord because the triad is diminished and the 7th is not. When we add a minor third on top of a diminished triad, the interval we get between the root and the top note is a diminished 7th. This would be the same interval as a major 6th, but because we're stacking thirds, we call this a diminished 7th instead. So this chord is simply called a diminished 7th chord because both the 7th and the triad are diminished. And then lastly, we've got our 2 augmented chords here. Here I'm also going to add a major third and a minor third. Now with this first one, things get a bit weird because you can see here this pink light tells you that this is actually the root note. So the same note as the bottom one. So we're still kind of dealing with a triad here more than a seventh chord. In theory, this is an augmented seventh and not an octave, but in practice it's the same note. So let's listen to it real quick to make this even more apparent. Pay attention to how when I get rid of this top note, the chord still sounds almost the same. And then there's the very last one. This will be an augmented triad with a minor third on top, and the interval this leads to is a major seventh.
So this one would be called a augmented major seventh chord.
So when we keep in mind that one of those augmented chords is actually not really a seventh chord, what we get is 7 instead of 8 different seventh chords. You can also see here some of the symbols that are being used to describe those chords. Unfortunately, they vary and oftentimes different abbreviations mean the same thing. So here's an overview of the most common ones that I know of. So now that we know what kinds of seventh chords we get by just stacking minor and major thirds, let's have a look at what seventh chords occur naturally in a major scale. So I'm going to turn on scale mode here. This gives me a C major scale right here. And then I'm going to start stacking thirds. Stacking 3 of them will always give me a seventh chord. Now I'm going to do the same thing starting on every note of the C major scale. We already know what the triads are that we get when we stack thirds on every note of a major scale. So let's go over those one more time. They are major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, and diminished on the 7. So let's have a look now at what kinds of sevenths we get when we add yet another third on top of those triads. For the first one, this is a major seventh. You can see this when I turn off scale mode. So here on top you can see there's another major third giving us a major seventh in relation to the root. Then for the chord starting on the second note of a major scale, we get a minor seventh chord. Again here, look at the interval on top, it's a minor third, so this will lead to a minor seventh. Then next there's the 3 chord, starting on the third note of the major scale. This will also be a minor seventh chord. Have a look here at the interval on top, it's a minor third, and this in relation to the root will be a minor seventh. Then the 4 chord is a major triad, and the 7th we get on top is a major seventh. Here, when we go back out of scale mode, we can see there's a major third on top. Then on the 5 chord, we've also got a major triad, but this time we get a minor seventh. Let's double check here too. The interval on top is a minor third. Then the 6th chord, one more time, will be a minor chord, and it has a minor seventh on top. So just like the 2 and the 3 chord. This minor third added to a 5th will lead to a minor seventh. And then the last one is our diminished chord. And when we look at the interval between the bottom and the top note, this is also a minor seventh. And this one, like I mentioned earlier, we usually call a half diminished seventh chord. When we look at the interval structure here, we can see we have a major third on top of a diminished triad. So that adds up to a minor seventh. And that's all of them. So here's a quick summary. On the 1, there's a major seventh chord. On the 2, a minor seventh chord. 3 chord is also a minor seventh chord. The 4 chord, a major seventh chord. The 5 chord, a dominant seventh chord. The 6, a minor seventh chord. And the 7, a half diminished chord.
We don't get any augmented seventh chords this way. We don't get a diminished seventh chord this way. And we don't get a minor major seventh chord this way. They do occur when we start with other scales. For example, a minor major seventh chord would be the 1 chord derived from a harmonic minor scale. But for now, we're just going to stick to the ones in the major scale to keep things simple and easy. Now, of course, because we have more notes in the chord now, there are also more inversions. For triads, we had 3 inversions because the chord consists of 3 notes, and we can have the root or the third or the fifth at the bottom, and now we have 4 notes in the chord, and obviously we're getting 4 inversions now. They're still called root position, first inversion, second inversion, and third inversion now.
Let's go through them real quick. This is the root position for this major 7th chord right here. Then with the third at the bottom, we've got the first inversion. And then the 5th at the bottom will be the second inversion. And the 7th at the bottom will give you the third inversion. Let's listen to those 4 different inversions so you get an idea of what they sound like. Let's have a look at an example chord progression here to maybe give you an idea of what they can be useful for. So we've got here a 1 chord, a 4 chord, and a 6 chord, and a 2 chord, all in root position. And this is what this sounds like. This sounds fine, but sometimes it is desirable to keep the movement in the individual voices to a minimum. So I'm going to try to do that here in this second half of the sequence by entering the same chords one more time, but in different inversions now. Let's listen to this and pay attention to how the first 4 chords moving in parallel jump around a lot more, while the second 4 chords seem to have much smoother transitions. I'm going to add a bass now on a second track, and I'm just going to add all the root notes. So this way, the 2 chord progressions will sound much more alike, because technically they're all in root position, because the lowest note is always going to be the root. But the way in which the individual voices are progressing is going to be different. For example, in the second half here, the lowest voice is always going to play a C. I'm sure there's applications for both, but in many scenarios, something like we have in the second half here is the more elegant solution, I think. So let's have a look now at what inversions we're actually dealing with here. The 1 chord is still in root position with the C at the bottom. Then this same C turns into the 5th of our 4 chord, a F major chord. So this is a second inversion. And then it turns into the 3rd of a 6 chord, a minor chord, which is the first inversion. And then lastly, it turns into the 7th of a D minor chord. And the 7th at the bottom tells us that this is the 3rd inversion. One thing worth mentioning when it comes to 7th chords is that the 5th is the 1 note in a 7th chord that doesn't really add a whole lot to the character of the chord. So oftentimes when we would prefer our chord to be a little less dense, it's perfectly fine to omit the 5th altogether. So I'm going to do this here for all the chords. Just get rid of the 5ths. As you can hear, this sounds very similar, and the basic character of the chords is still maintained. And because I now have a bass track playing the root notes, I could also get rid of the root notes here because we don't need them twice. So all we're left with here is a bunch of 7ths and 3rds that make up the core of those 7th chords. Now they may be a bit harder to identify, but basically are still the same chords as before.
So yeah, I think that's all I've got to say about 7th chords for now. Particularly about 7th chords in the context of a diatonic major scale. If there's anything you would like to know about in music theory that you think I could explain on the Deluge, please let me know. It's always nice to hear what people are curious about. And for now, let me say thanks a lot for watching, and bye-bye.